Music has got to be one of the coolest things that humans do.
I like to help teachers change their business model and be able to fix that so that it supports the lifestyle that they want to.
I really want to make sure that I'm in like a good arc of my practice routine where it's like I've been at it, and it feels really natural because it's just more fun. You can show off more of what there is to be found if you spend time at the instrument.
What does your studio actually look like? What is like the offers that you have? Like what is the model that you're working through right now?
So generally, I mean, I just get like genuinely bummed out if I don't practice. Like
Yeah.
it is like music, and this is, part of the joy of teaching it, of course. Music has got to be one of the coolest things that humans do. And so if I find myself, and it's funny, obviously, like you teach music, you're constantly at the instrument. So it's not like you're not doing piano, so to speak, or doing music. But there's a big difference between, like coaching your kids or like helping other returning adults and get back into it or whatnot, and the stuff that you normally would go over with them, and then what, might be the outer limit of your abilities. And if you don't spend time with that, then it starts to feel like you don't have that outer limit, and it's a huge bummer. And then it's like so like wonderful when you go back and you're like, oh right, I can do these really cool things, or like if I'm on top of this, it feels really easy for me. Like that's great. The last, whatever, 25 years of trying really hard haven't just gone out the window. Fantastic.
100%. Do you ever feel like you like, or at least for a lot of teachers, like that's the main thing. It's like I like to help teachers change their business model and be able to fix that so that it supports the lifestyle that they want to. Like for you, how important have you found it to make sure that you are like practicing what you preach and like always practicing the piano like for yourself?
How important or how easy do I find it?
Oh, like how important is that? And then also how like is it easy for you also?
It's very important. It's not easy at all. In that order. Like, I find that my teaching experience is so much more fun, and I am much better at it if I am practicing regularly. Where, like, there's a creativity that you find in practicing your own stuff. You're like, okay, this thing is kicking my butt. Like, what can I do to grapple with it and find my way to like some sort of like, phew, we're on the same team now, these 16 measures or whatever. Um, and that really like drives what I would suggest to any student when they come in with their problems. It's like, oh, you know what I was doing earlier today is I actually just looked at like this two-note transfer because everything around it I was actually able to do just fine. It was just this like microscopic detail where like my finger shape was wrong or something. And like there's a spontaneous creative response to the problems that students have that's much more accessible if you're practicing it your own, like on your own self, on your own efforts.
Yeah. Does that translate at all through like your own marketing or maybe you're like talking to a new student or something like a new prospect or something? Does that translate there in terms of the confidence that you have?
Certainly. Oh yeah. No, and it's exactly the same thing where like particularly in meeting new students or something, I really want to make sure that I'm in like a good arc of my practice routine where it's like I've been at it, and it feels really natural because it's just more fun. You can show off more of what there is to be found if you spend time at the instrument. Whereas like you can kind of insist that it exists if you're feeling awkward, but it's a more tenuous claim.
Yeah, I feel it a lot too. Like this month, like to be honest, has been a really big push month for the marketing. Like I'm posting a lot of content, I'm posting a lot of these videos. So I haven't like I have to be honest with myself, like I haven't like put a lot of time into my own music production lately. So today, like I put like today I just opened the computer and I was working on my music again. I feel so much like better because of it. Like so yeah, 100%.
I mean, it's just I like to think I'm not a boring guy, but I certainly feel like that is the most interesting thing I do. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
it's like, oh, it's like time traveling, but it sounds nice.
So just for some context, like for at least for me as well, like what does your studio actually look like? What is like the offers that you have? Like what is the model that you're working through right now?
So generally, there's sort of three main parts. Two of them are piano. And with the piano stuff, there's sort of the work I do with kids, and then there's the work I do with adults. And it's fairly different. The kids, I work on like a tuition model, and part of that is I got to a point doing just whatever, like selling Apple style lessons where it's like, yeah, you pay me by the lesson and whatever. Like, I don't know, if you don't bring the money, then we have to go through a whole rigmarole of like, oh, don't forget to bring it next week and stupid things like that. And I just found myself talking to parents about money all the time instead of talking about how like the kids were doing, or like being focused on what we were like the project at hand. So I use a software called Fons, Fons. They're great. There are at least a few, I should say, things that are like them. Like I think My Music Staff is another one that people use. But just that idea of automating scheduling and billing makes it really easy, and then having monthly tuition makes it really easy. And then also, I kept finding myself with what I figured were good ideas of like, oh, here's a thing that will really help this, particularly online, right? We have to be really creative about like, how are you going to make sure that they have notes? Like, because if you're in person, you're filling something out in the lesson, you send them home with their binder or whatever it might be, and phew, that's off my back. But if it's an online lesson, like if they're not of an age where they can be trusted to have a pencil out writing whatever notes as we're going, then you still want them to have something to reference, something to look back at. And so for me, that turns into like I make after lesson videos for the kids that I work with, where they're usually like,
Oh, so they can like watch afterwards and things like
yeah,
that?
they're like real quick, like,
Nice.
don't forget, this is what we talked about. And these were like the main things with this piece. Watch out for that. Over here on your warm ups, make sure to focus on this part, blah, blah, blah. Um, and for the impatient ones, I'm like, look, watch it double speed. I don't care if you like give it its space. Just watch it at least one time, ideally the day after our lesson. Um, and so that's like something where if I weren't doing it in this kind of bundled way, it'd be like, well, that's like my time. And it's not time inside of the lesson. So it would feel weird, like nickel and diming style, to be like, oh, and I'm going to charge you this extra like 6 minutes that I spent making your kid a video. And it's like, it's nothing I want to make opt in because I would hate it if somebody opted out because I think it's something necessary, or at least the way that I do it.
Yeah, so you kind of just include it with the price already.
Yes. Mhm.
Nice, nice.
And then for my student spread, like with the kids anyways, some of them are up here, and so I do like a once a month in person thing at a studio space.
Oh, okay.
Call it my office hours. They can sign up on a Google
Nice.
poll, and then we hang out. It's usually like the first Saturday of the month, barring whatever weirdness the month may provide for that particular day. But then for my adults, I mostly specialize in like returning adults because I am one. Like I was a all piano all the time from about 4 years old until about 15, and then went on like a 12-year walkabout and came back to it in my late 20s and fell absolutely in love with it and have since spent as many years diving as deep as I can. Um, but so I can really relate to the experience of somebody in their 30s or whatever being like, I really miss this thing I used to love as a kid and then I just got away from, and I've had a life, I've got a kid or two or whatever, and kind of want to do something that's about me or about my interests.
Yeah, 100%. I think like it's super important, especially with like finding a teacher. One of the things that I talk about with my clients a lot is like like usually our ideal clients, our ideal students is us from the past. So like for you, how have you like how have you shared your story to make that more relatable to like students that are like choosing you between you or someone else or something like that? Like how has your story contributed to the growth in your studio?
I mean, I think I'm able to relate in a more honest and immediate way to the struggles that they're facing. And I can do it for all of my students, but the adults absolutely have like the truest line on that, where it's like, no, 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 I know exactly what it feels like. Like it's not long ago. Uh, you know, whatever 12 years at this point can feel like a long ago, but by comparison to if you start at the age of 4 and you never stop, then when you learned is really long ago. And so in that sense, like when I'm working with adults, because like if there's one thing everybody learns to do by their mid 30s, it's be entirely too critical of themselves. And so like adult students really struggle. They're like, oh, I'm just an idiot, I can't get this, surely everybody could just transpose right away. It's like, no, it's very hard. You have to understand a lot. You have to know exactly how to look at it so that you can set yourself up for success. Like, give yourself a break, please.
Yeah. So for you, when was that When was that shift for you to come back to piano, like you personally?
There were, like, a couple false starts between 15 and 26, where it's like, I got a keyboard at some point as, like, a gift from my grandma or something when I was still in college. I was like, "Oh, this is kind of fun." I do remember, and I did a little bit, and then I don't know, got distracted, and then didn't really sink into it. Still kind of looked at it as something that I used to do. Always missed it. Like, that's the thing, and that's why adults return. It's because you always think about it because it is this really cool thing, and it's like, particularly if it's something you did as a kid, it's all tied up with like the sort of fondness and nostalgia you have for the best of those times, right?
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
that.
And so, like, you get to a point where you look back at it, and for me, it just was serendipitous. I was living with somebody who had recently inherited a Baldwin Grand, like one of the 7-footers. We were living in a place that fit that well. And then we got snowed in. And like they were out of town, and so it was just me in this house with a grand piano for like 2.5 days, not able to go anywhere or do anything. Well, I guess I'll try this out, see how it goes. I'm like, oh, this is lovely. Somebody's not driving you to do it, and it's not like you gotta do this, go do the thing. It's like, oh no, this is voluntary now. I love this.
It's a beautiful thing when you get like when you get to choose to come back to it again. Like for me, like I my experience with piano was like kind of like the typical like kid that was forced to play the piano pretty much. And uh I I got to that point where like piano became a chore for me. And it wasn't until like high school band when I started like liking music. I started like choosing it as well. And it was mostly part of like the experience that I got with like the community and meeting new friends that really like brought me back. And then especially with like music production now, like it was a time when I wasn't playing music at all anymore, especially the end of 2022. Um, I was like, I need to get back into music because I hadn't played like organized music since college. And that was even before COVID because like a year and a half of my college was during COVID. So I didn't even get to play in ensembles or anything like that. So like being able to choose music again and get back into that, like I feel like that's a very like it's a very beautiful process right
Oh
there.
yeah. Honestly, like it comes up in the context of how I interact with the adults that I teach and sort of how it feeds that, but it has a huge impact on how I work with my kids also, and like how I coach my parents in terms of like, don't force
How
your
so? Yeah, what does that look like?
one thing it looks like, and this is, perhaps sacrilegious, but particularly with the young ones, I tend not to start under the age of 7, unless, like, case by case, some kid is, like, particularly precocious at that age or something. But I really don't think for the first year, even up to, like, the first 2, it really matters a whole bunch if they're practicing. Because I think, like, I've had kids where they don't practice week after week, but they're at that age where every single thing we talk about at a lesson, when they come back to their next lesson, they can tell me about. It's like, "Oh, you didn't forget anything." It's like, it's just Terra Nova in there, isn't it? And, like, the moment we put down a footprint, it's there forever. Great. Because if that's the case, and I think it tends to be that way with a lot of kids where they keep track of what you've said, but if they're, like, in some situation where the parent thinks that they need like, it's really important they be practicing, they're gonna get in fights. And they're gonna make this beautiful thing something that's, like, strugglesome, something that, like, puts them into a situation where they get forced to do it. And it's like, make the case for it first and then be like, "Oh, you like this? Well, here's how we can get better." You come to these recitals and you hear what the kids are playing and you're like, "You love that piece? Well, here's what we gotta do to get there."
That's what I've been like learning too. It's like if I were to go back and relearn piano, I would tell myself I would I would parent myself to make myself fall in love with music first before I get to know it. And I feel like me being forced to learn how to get good at it, like I didn't learn how to actually love the craft itself. And it's uh it it's like like Michael Jordan. Like what for him, like the way he grew up, the reason why he's so good is because he loves the craft so much. He learned to love it first, and then he started playing like organized ball after that. So like if I were to go back and redo it again, like I would just focus on having fun and liking music, and then getting to the point where I like it so much that I want to get better at it.
Well, and it's, kids are different, and like some kids it's pretty easy. Like they get it, they're into it, they want to learn more, they know like and usually it's like math in schools or something. It's like, oh, that means you have like a musical parent in the house or something and they're like hanging out playing music with you, or like
Yeah.
you have this sort of inroad. Like with math kids, it's like, oh yeah, you have some parent that sits down and is like, look at these fun puzzles we can do with this stuff and like this kind of thinking. It's like suddenly it seems like they're a genius at it. It's like, no, 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 they're just already doing it. So like the kids that aren't that way, the ones that are, maybe more sensitive and maybe more in the part of their lives where like they cannot handle being corrected, you have to have a way to like hang out and sort of have like a no wrong answers approach. And that kind of doubles back to that idea of like, if I'm practicing, I'm much more prepared to meet those kids. Be like, oh, why don't we just, okay, if we can find the groups of three and the groups of two, why don't we just talk about like the notes on the outside of a group of two and find as many of those and as many different combinations as we possibly can across the whole piano, and see if we can't like make a song. And just like, there's the classic one of like, what if you only play black keys? Well, it's going to sound
Yeah,
nice.
and then they start exploring
Hmm.
that whole like realm right there.
I like to play a question and answer game that evolves over the course of lessons with kids, where it's just like, okay, we'll do it with rhythm at first. So, like, this is my question. Give me an answer. And
Mm,
ideally they do something that kind of at least tracks the rhythm of it, and so on. And then from there, like at the more advanced levels, it would be like, okay, well, we're in this kind of like chord progression space. So why don't, you do something like, and that's your question. And then I'll answer it. And then you do another question or whatever. And you can just make
yeah.
music with kids without having to be so preoccupied with the paper.
Yeah, exactly. So with like the adults, like what I was curious about too was like with the adults that you get on is the like with most of them being returners, is that like an intentional thing, or is that kind of like it's just naturally the people that are attracted to you are those returners, or is that like something you're intentionally doing with trying to get more, like when you're trying to get more students, like that's something you're marketing out?
It turns out that way more than I intended to be that way, but I enjoy that. And I certainly like the verbiage on my website sort of reflects, the quick version of my story. So anybody that makes their way there through one avenue or another would find like, oh, here's a guy who came back and like, hey, I want to do that. And, maybe they have some insight. I do have a couple students who are like adult students that are starting fresh as adults. Usually, like I'm thinking of two in particular. One was just like flat out no music in her family, and like I mean no musicians in her family, I should say, and had never done anything with it. Is on the older side. She's I think in her late 50s, I want to say, and it's just like starting from scratch, and it's a very different experience. It's fun. She is somebody who, like, again, adults have like the worst sense of perspective in terms of like how other people experience things. She just assumes that everything is easy for everybody else and it's only really hard for her, and I'm constantly like, no, 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 you're actually doing quite well, it's just hard, that's all. And then the other one is somebody that I got hooked up with by virtue of one of the kiddos that I work with. It's like a friend of a mom was like, "Oh, who's so and so's teacher?" And she, "Oh, I think he teaches adults too." I love working with him. It's great. I love working with anybody. Weird side note: I love working in music and in piano with anybody that has any sort of martial arts background or other like
Oh,
physical
really? How
activity,
come?
because body awareness and like
Oh.
the ability to be like, "Look, can you like set all the weight of your arm out at the tip of your finger? Can you send your brain from shoulder to wrist and just check that you're not holding on to it anywhere? And then can you like try and just roll that over one note?" I've never done much of it, but I hear about it from the adults that match this description where they're like, "Oh yeah, they do a thing where it's like, okay, now stand. Now I want you to feel the fact that you're standing. I want you to feel the ground through your feet. I want you to feel every part of that." And it's the same wavelength. It's the same
Yeah,
attitude.
that's cool, that's cool.
Hmm.
I didn't know there's, like, a connection there.
Anything that's super into body awareness, like, think like, it's so, that's a fun question for the kids is like, "What do we play the piano with?" And the answer is always the fingers, our hands. It's like, no, our whole freaking body. And so you wanna be paying attention to it all, stretch when you sit down, like, breathe, close your eyes and feel.
I love that, I love that. So I guess for now, your journey, if we kinda, like, widen the scope here with the way that you've grown the studio, how has that progression been on, like, what the studio used to start off with, and then how did it get to where it is now in terms of, like, maybe the structure of it or maybe your schedule? Because with a lot of teachers, what I see is, like, they'll start their studio one way, and then they'll stick with it the same way until they've, like, even to the point, like, after they've kind of outgrown their model. So, like, for you, what does that journey look like for you personally?
So that's I like that question. You mentioned something earlier about the beginning of yours, where like looking around and seeing what other people are doing, or maybe even just like people that you work with, where they try to copy this one or that one. And when you were talking about that, I was like, I would never want to copy somebody's whole cloth, but I am very mercenary in my like attitude towards like what are other people doing that works, and does that
Mhm.
address something that feels like it doesn't for me right now?
Yeah.
Because when I started, like I said earlier, it was not very many students, paid by the lesson, charging way too little. But also at the time, I was like, well, I'm just learning it. This is, they're paying me to learn at the moment as much as they're paying me to teach. So, okay, fine, I'm fine with it. But eventually that sucks. And then likewise, in terms of like the scheduling parts of it, it would just be like, "Oh, well, I guess whenever you can do it is when we can do lessons." And so I would find myself with days where it's like a 3 o'clock lesson or something on a Thursday, and then a 5 o'clock lesson on a Monday. It's like somehow that one lesson manages to dominate that whole day. And so, like between the way that I charged, the rate that I charged, um, the sort of style of scheduling, all of that is radically different for me now. So I condense all my stuff on Monday through Thursday, which means those days are long, but that means I have a 3-day weekend every week, which means I can actually like have, if I'm good about my boundaries anyway, and not like responding to every email that comes in, that I can have a life. I can actually hang out with my partner. We can go and do things.
What are those boundaries and standards for you that you've had to raise as you've, like, just experienced more in your studio?
Struggle. The boundaries, as much as anything, is I need to be comfortable if somebody writes me on a Saturday, not responding until Monday. And it like messes with me, particularly because at the very beginning, when you don't have very many clients, like everyone that gets hold, and this is the thing, I'll break that boundary every time for a new inquiry. If somebody that I've never heard from before shoots me an email on Saturday night at 10 o'clock and they're like, "Hey, I just found your website and I'm looking for lessons." Like my goal is by 10:30 they've got an answer in their inbox. But once it's established, once we're like, okay, cool, we like each other, we're doing the thing, then like ratcheting that back to I will respond on Monday, and like not find myself trapped on my phone when I'm out on a date or whatever.
100%.
So
I think that's super important because, like when you're saying that even that one lesson on your schedule can dominate the entire day, like, I really felt that a
yeah.
lot. It's just like part of my story is, like, I was doing coaching and piano teaching at the same time, and it got to the point where I was full on both ends of it, and I wanted to, like, go all in on coaching because I felt like that's where my impact was best, but I didn't know how to, like, I didn't know how to break the news to a lot of my piano students. So there's a whole, yeah. So I had this whole, like, year long process where I was just not taking on any more students, but I was just like, if they wanted to leave, then they could leave. And it got down to like four more students left, and this was like four back to back students, and I had to drive over as well. So it was like a 3 hour. It was like a 3 hour period for 2 hours of worth of lessons,
Hmm.
including the travel time, and it was like in the middle of like a
Yeah.
Wednesday. And that was it. That was my only teaching. But I remember like just feeling stressed on Monday for some
Yeah.
reason for my Wednesday lesson. And like because that was the only thing on my day or in my week of like teaching, I like it was just burning me out just thinking of that. So when like finally I didn't have to teach lessons anymore,
Hmm.
and I can focus full in on coaching, like like my mindset. My mind was just like so much more clear
Yeah.
because of that. So I really felt that when you said
Oh,
that.
yeah. And I mean, just in the interest of like owning where any of the good ideas that I have come from, I mean, it really is finding teachers that I'm impressed by and just asking questions like, what are you
Mm,
doing? How do you do this?
yeah.
Uh,
What for you? What have you learned? Like, what have you learned about yourself on what's gonna work best for you?
I need something that keeps like what works best for me is something that keeps me excited about what people are doing and keeps me compassionate when they're not doing that. And so that's like I can be much more compassionate and much more responsive if I'm good with my own music stuff. And then I'm not projecting like, well, I'm dropping the ball over here, so you better not, because then nobody's doing anything. And so that's like a big part of it for me, and getting as much of the dry work automated or sort of just behind a
Mhm.
curtain as possible, where it's just like,
Yeah.
if I talk to you, I want to talk to you about music and how to work on music and what there is to enjoy or explore about music and like opportunities in your world. Like that is what's interesting to me. Like
Mhm.
the running a business is interesting in a very minimal way,
Yeah.
insofar as it's like optimizing the experience is interesting,
Yeah.
and seeing how other people have done that, and seeing like, well, does that fit me? Does that fit my personality? Does that
Mhm.
fit what I love about this, or not?
Same way, same way.
Yeah.
I think for me, like what works I find myself thriving when I have like like an empty calendar, when I have a lot of blank space and I can like be able to kind of get into that creative zone, especially either when I'm creating content or when I'm like making my own music. Like I like to just have like a time, like a few hours where I could just like get in the zone and do what I can in that few hours. So
Yeah.
what I've been doing a lot is like um making limitations on my schedule, kind of like for you with like Monday through Thursday only teaching. Like
Mhm.
for me, I have like Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays is my client days.
Mhm.
And then like Mondays and Wednesdays is like my marketing and content creation days as well. So it's like testing out, like I've tested out theming my days too. And that's also really helped with keeping my energy in the same like box at a time. So I'm not switching between a client and then all of a sudden I'm going to like a new prospect and then all of a sudden I'm like having to create content. I feel like that switching of the hats thing is really what's caused a lot of my burnout in the past
Yeah.
as well.
It's funny you say that, because on one and the same time, like I know what you mean when you say that, and I relate to it. And then also there are parts of the way that I run mine that, on a grander scale, would fit that description that I really treasure. So I mentioned like
Uh-huh.
there are kind of three
Yeah.
chunks of my business, and one of them is the kids, one of them is the adults, the other one is math. So I work with like
Oh.
math kids.
Uh-huh.
And mostly pre-calculus and calculus, and rare, probably typically about 20% of my studio is that and 80% is music. But
Mhm.
I treasure like the variety there, just because it keeps me sort of like mentally agile, I suppose. And also, like, if music is one of the coolest things that humans have done, math is definitely on that short list also.
Yeah, funny thing is that like I applied to SDSU and I applied to UCSD, and I applied to SDSU as a music major because they have like their own music school there. But then UCSD, I applied as a math major as well.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so funny thing there.
No, it was very unintentional for me, but basically towards the end of my arts degree, I had a class that challenged me with math language and challenged me with like essentially calculus, whatever, Greek, some of this series notation, that kind of thing. And I was like, well, this is very frustrating. And so I went and I was like, well, what could I do about this? I guess I'll take a math class. And had a really good teacher. And it's like, oh, I really like this. I thought I hated it from whatever high school, but it turns out I was mistaken. Um,
Nice, nice,
and
nice.
so I ended up sticking around for like an extra year and a half in my undergrad to get a second degree, to get a math degree. Yeah, I love it. It's great. It's, again, this massive thousands of years human project, in the same way that music is, where we just keep building and it's cool.
I love that. Love that. I had I had a conversation with another piano teacher last week, and we're just kind of like catching up, and he's talking about his journey of like like going from like he's performing a lot and he wants to get back into teaching. Um, but he was also talking about like just the different stages of like how he's performed, like going from cruises to like working on like more like land shows and things like that. But one of the things that he said that I thought was really important was that he got to a point where he realized that the way that he was living his life wasn't serving him anymore. And I feel like a lot of teachers do that as well, where they get to the point where they've grown their studios to a point where it doesn't serve them anymore, or it doesn't challenge them anymore, or doesn't allow them to grow. Like for you, have you gotten to that point with like your journey, and like how did you get to the point with just realizing that like, hey, what I'm doing right now isn't serving me anymore. I need to find another way to challenge me or grow. And like how did you become aware of that, and then how did you move on, like move forward?
Like the biggest thing that matches that description that comes to mind is the billing stuff. Like that's the one that stands out because a lot of the music stuff I am constantly exploring repertoire, and there's sort of like a mix of teaching repertoire and then just like stuff that I'm interested in, and then also like different method series. So like if I see somebody talking about, oh, I love, Piano Safari, it's like, well, I've never really done anything with those. So I'm going to grab like the basics and I'm going to maybe a few of their other things and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to play with them. And like with that as an explicit example, I just started a student on their method. And I was like, I don't know, it's all dealing with the same stuff, but it'll be interesting to see how this one works. Um, and that kind of keeps things fresh for me. Also, like I'm pretty responsive, and this is partly like helping students take like ownership of the project. Is like I'm pretty responsive to, oh, you want to do that kind of thing? Okay, well, let's figure out how to do that kind of thing. And that keeps me sort of constantly interested in like, oh, we're gonna do a lot of jazz stuff now, huh? All right, well, let's learn more about it. Like I've got sort of the underpinning foundations, like I know the theory stuff, but let's try and put it to work. Or like, oh, you want to, write your own stuff. Okay, well, here, I'll figure out how to use MuseScore, and then we can actually do like sort of fancy professional versions of it, and kind of like that suddenly becomes a chunk of our lessons of like just compositional stuff.
Yeah. So you're always kind of like keeping yourself sharp
Hmm.
for your students.
Yeah. Well, and it's the best thing about being a teacher is if you really want to learn how to do it, teach somebody else. Because it's like it gives you the motivation, it gives you the opportunity, and like every single student that you visit the stuff with, you're like, oh, I noticed something this time that I had never noticed before. And then sometimes it's profound, sometimes it's simple, but always it's interesting.
So with your students, like is there any stories of like is there any stories where you felt like you had a challenge in terms of teaching, and then you're really proud of what you were able to accomplish, like by like figuring it out for your students?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of hinted at it earlier, but I have a student right now who is extremely sensitive. Um, and like very much a will just it breaks them if I suggest that anything they did wasn't exactly what they intended to do, which makes bookwork in particular like very challenging to take on. And so it's something where originally we had kind of set out a plan first meeting. We're like, oh, we'll try these books and we'll kind of like take it on this way, and by age and by a parent's like intelligence and character, I was like, oh, this should be fine. And then like the sensitivity started showing up in lessons. I was like, oh, well, I don't want to like torture you with this stuff either, because they'd be something like, I don't know, have you had students where they'll turn things upside down? I assume it's fairly common, but
It's yeah, I've had it in the past, yeah, where like sensitive students. I know exactly what you mean by that.
yeah. Well, and even just like in the sense of the thing on the page says, and what they'll do is where they like literally turn it upside down, or they'll read the left hand part with the right hand and vice versa, and those kinds of weird things where it's like there's really no harm, no foul in doing it. It's an easy thing to point out, like, oh, don't worry, just like raise your eyes a little bit or lower them a little bit and like look at the other thing or like block that out or whatever we need to do. And this was a student who, like, if I would bring up that kind of adjustment, would just like go catatonic. Like it was just like I had, wounded them. And so it was something where I had to figure out like, okay, well, that means we probably can't hang out in the book stuff for a little while, but I want to make sure that in our time together, like we're still learning stuff. And so that idea of what I was talking about earlier with the like finding the notes on the outside of a group of two and then finding different combinations, it's that student I started doing that with. And now I do it with lots of them, because it's this fun way with particularly younger students to kind of somewhere between rote and like true exploration. Um, and so they're able to kind of make up their own stuff that sounds a little more interesting than like, I don't know, I just did this and then I did that, and sometimes I like it and
Yeah.
sometimes I don't.
So what did you learn from about yourself now as like a teacher or like even like a mentor to them?
If anything, it has given me a lot of confidence in, from the very get-go, not working with books, which is like the holy grail as far as I'm concerned. Is like, what if never a method book? What if you just worked on music for a while and then you started doing repertoire? Wouldn't that be cool? And that's a hard thing. Like, it's an aspirational thing still, but like being forced into that, like to let go of the security blanket of the method and just be like, okay, we're gonna find a way to learn. We're gonna find a way to make music together, and we're gonna enjoy ourselves, and we're gonna actually be learning. It's not like we're just teasing ourselves or tricking ourselves into it. It's like, no, 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 no. We've got the musical alphabet. We know how these sounds fit together. And not only that, like the finding the outside of a group of two thing evolved into, well, now we find the outside notes of a group of three. And now maybe we talk about it as like, oh, this is a C and E space. And this is an F and B space. And maybe we make our goal like, okay, we're going to hang out in here. And every so often, why don't we go to the other space? And like that just elaborates the kind of music we can make up. But all of that was stuff that like my eyes went wide at first when the challenge kind of became clear. It was like, oh my god, how are we going to do this? Like,
Yeah.
am I going to have to like, am I going to have to fire this student? I don't want to. He's such a sweet kid, but I just don't know how to. Well, maybe I could try this, and that just kept rolling.
I love that. Yeah. I think it's always good to be able to like challenge ourselves, but then like level always be like leveling up ourselves as teachers as well. I think it's like it's always super important.
Because as you say, that
Yeah.
is what helps us not burn out. So if you just do the
Yes,
same
yes.
thing over and over and over again, even if it's as cool as this.
Yeah. So looking forward now, like what's the next step for Ryan?
um, Knock a few things that have nothing to do with music out of the way. Mostly, I think ages ago it feels like, but it wasn't that long ago. But there was some point where we were possibly going to meet a few years ago, and then I bought a house with my partner. And so just like the work of settling into that
Nice.
house,
Congrats.
thank you. Yeah, it's tremendous. But it was just a lot of work, and like kind of pushed me to the edge where it was like, okay, right now keeping everything together is sort of the outer limit. And that has sort of subsided and has like a little bit more to go. But setting that aside, I make all these damn videos, and it would be nice to figure out a way to like push that into a course, find passive income essentially. So that's
Ooh.
something I'm
Nice,
interested in.
nice.
With the math stuff, I think it'd be cool to get into like small group sessions, because I do one-on-one at the moment, but I think I think it would be fun to push into like three or four kids at a time, and then just have
Yeah.
like a lesser rate, but as three or four students actually have it be quite a bit more for my time. And also just, I don't know, when you can get it, like the community part of things is a really helpful aid to learning, I think, right?
Yeah, 100%. I like moving into groups too, because it was something that I didn't realize as I was doing it when I was teaching piano, but like being in like a group setting really forces you to be a better leader for your students as well. Now that like we have to let go of some of that control when we're not in like a one-on-one setting, like I really like that about having groups that it kind of like pushes you to be a better leader naturally.
Oh yeah. And it's, I mean, it's pushes you to be a better leader, and not only that, it gives your students and the people you're working with the opportunity to reinforce their own confidence by little like micro dosing leadership moments, where it's like, oh yeah, just for a little bit, I'm going to be the one that teaches about this concept because it's one of the things I understand. And so like that's always like I do group classes with my piano students, but with the mathies, I think that would be, I don't know, commiseration is important.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That'd be
So
awesome. Definitely do that.
yeah,
Cool. Well, I guess last thing is the question of going back to Ryan from the past. What would you tell him? Like like especially other teachers that were in your position in the past as well. What would you be able to share that can help?
join a teachers organization.
Mm,
Like, don't be so proud, because I've gotten so much out of being involved with like lately the Seattle Music Teachers Association, but generally the MTNA, Music Teachers National. In terms of just like a like that mercenary attitude I described earlier, where it's like that is the opportunity to see, hundreds of different teaching styles or insights or what have you, and be like, oh, and this one's for me, and that one's for me, and this one's for me,
yeah,
but that one's not. And I think I was just somewhere between intimidated when I first started, like, oh gosh, I don't know, and then after a while, I was like, well, I don't really want. I don't know. I just like the fear of opening myself up to like other people doing the same thing on whatever ground, whether it was like I don't want people to tell me what to do, or I'm like nervous as to how I'll stack up. It's like everybody's out there learning, everybody's out there still figuring it out every day. And the sooner that you sort of get some people to like touch base with and compare notes with and say your ideas out loud to hear how they kind of roll off the tongue, like the better off you'll be.
I love that. Yeah, always being a student, always being a student. Sweet. Appreciate you again for your time, but for your wisdom and like having this conversation and being able to share it as well. Like if anyone had any questions of like to reach out to you, like what is the best place to connect with you?
Oh, hit me on the website. Whatever, yeah, notesandnumbers.net. You can just, there's a contact link there.
Yeah, I'll put. Feel free to send that to me. I'll put it in like the description of the
Sure.
video.
Awesome, man.
But
Oh, this has
yeah,
been a lot of fun.
appreciate you so
Yeah,
much.
thank
This
you.
was this was a lot of fun. But if anyone wants to reach out to Brian, feel free to. And like always happy to chat.